Last week, Bishop David Zubik of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh appeared on this program to talk about the anticipated release of the findings of a Pennsylvania state grand jury investigating sex abuse by certain members of the Roman Catholic clergy in a number of dioceses in Pennsylvania, including here in Pittsburgh. Bishop Zubik is back with us this morning to discuss the grand jury report, the allegations of a cover-up, and where the Catholic Church and its leadership go from here. Also with us is Rita Joyce, the Chancellor of the Diocese, an attorney and an expert on church canon law. She has served as a tribunal judge for the diocese as well. I want to thank both of you for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. Bishop Zubik, you were able to listen to our interviews that we had just prior to this. I don't want to get into a he said thing here, but your reaction to some of the things that were said.
Well, I think first of all, in terms of the impression of some people that there was a cover-up, you know, either by my predecessor or myself. One of the things that hit me as a result of that was that I think we needed to be able to do more to be able to make sure people came to understand that neither Cardinal nor I have covered up. And there are two things that I think are important for people to pay attention to, which I don't think has been happening. The court ordered that our response to the grand jury be attached to the report when it was released, and it's there. And I'm not sure many people have read it, because I think, as your previous guests have said, when they talk about, well, the circle of secrecy, in our response, it shows that the circle of secrecy was not attributed to Cardinal Wuerl, and it describes, in fact, where that all came from. The second thing that I came to realize is that we needed to be able to do more than just say we weren't covering up. We have to show it. So what we've done since the report was released is to go back, and the list of offenders that we released the same day as the report was released, we now have, in fact, revised it so that it indicates not only the person's name and the date when the allegation came in, but the next column shows that every single offender was reported to law enforcement officials, and it indicates the date or dates on which that happened. So we're hoping that when people see that obviously we turned these things over, that there was no cover-up.
So every one of these was turned over?
Every one was turned over, and the dates are listed with the list of offenders.
Even the ones historically back?
Oh, sure.
Those were turned over?
Well, and in terms of some of those people that were way, way back, we turned those over, obviously, when the grand jury, when we turned everything over to the Attorney General's office.
I want to wrap up on one other aspect of the previous, our previous guests, and that is in relation to that priests all know of some other priest who have committed some sort of abuse.
Well, I don't know how anybody could know that for sure, but one of the things I can say is going back to 1988, when we had our first scandal of 3 priests that were accused of abusing 2 brothers. Bishop Wuerl convened all the clergy and said, if you know something, you better turn it over, because we have an obligation to do that. And that, of course, leads into one of the points that the Attorney General gave about, you know, there's penalties if you don't turn over, if you know something. And I think people understand the seriousness of that part of the law.
Without arguing that right and wrong change over time, surely conditions and procedures change over time. Do you wish, in retrospect, that more or different had been done? Oh,
heavens, yes. I mean, you go back and take a look at the first allegation in the Diocese of Pittsburgh came in 1935. Where people were in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is far different than where we are now, because, as I said last week when I was here, people didn't know how to deal with it. It's so horrific. People couldn't even believe that those kinds of things could happen. And I think that was the reason why people on all levels didn't know how to handle it. And I think over the course of the years...
what more might you have done, Bishop?
Well,
might the Church have done, the diocese have done, whatever?
I think if you take a look at the history of what we've been doing over the course of the last 30 years, you know, make sure that you have good policies and procedures. Make sure that you have independent people that can come and assess allegations and give advice to the bishop. Make sure you have a diocesan assistance coordinator who helps victims. Make sure that you encourage people to go to civil authorities. Make sure we do that ourselves as well, too. And that doesn't stop there. We have to continue to look for ways, and I indicated in my news conference at least 3 areas where we really want to be able to beef up and make our policies and procedures stronger.
The one attorney from Santa Barbara also indicated that you, Cardinal Wuerl, and the Church itself has said that the number of people who are claiming to be abused has now dropped off since 2002. He kind of scoffed at that and said that, you know, tell me 30, 40 years from now, not 5 or 10.
Well, I think we have to take a look at what's happened thus far. And when I had my news conference, I had a graph and showed what I talked about last week. 90% of the allegations in the Diocese of Pittsburgh came before 1990. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because it was in the late 80s, on the 90s, and moving forward that all of the policies and procedures came in, which did a couple of things. It made the horrific acts of sexual abuse of minors something that people had to take a look at, address, and it took a look at measures in which those things would in fact be addressed. And I do believe that the reason why those numbers have dropped dramatically is because of the institution of those policies and procedures. I
want to bring you into this discussion because we'll start to run out of time here. As a canon lawyer, is there anything in the church law that dictates to Bishop Zubik or Cardinal Wuerl how they have to handle these things?
The church has a very defined system of law. Canon law, 1,752 canons of the code, plus additional legislation that can be promulgated by the Vatican on any given situation that they deem necessary. This Pope, Pope Francis, has given new legislation on marriage cases as an example. But on the sexual abuse cases, yes, in the 2000s, the Vatican passed legislation that dictated to bishops that these were crimes, that they would be willing to waive the statute of any kind of statute of limitations that the Vatican might have had originally on these crimes in order to bring cases forward, because the Vatican was very interested also in eradicating this and assisting victims.
What about the issue that Bishop, now Cardinal Wuerl, has been criticized over the agreements that were reached, the payoffs to victims, but they couldn't talk about it?
You know, that's a very common way that cases were handled a long time ago. Victims oftentimes requested that amounts of money that they received for whatever reason, for medical assistance, for psychological assistance.
Well, no, but on the other side of this, the church wanted it quiet.
You know, it was, at times that could have been possible, but since 2002, the Charter has dictated that there be no confidentiality agreements signed. We have clearly adhered to that. And if there were any agreements signed in the past, the church would not hold a person to that agreement so that they couldn't talk about it.
Bishop, in retrospect, do you wish that some of these priests had not been reassigned after these allegations and these investigations?
Sure, but I want to say we have to contextualize where bishops were, and I think there are two important points to recognize. Especially in the 1990s, there was a great deal of trust that was placed in treatment centers, because these were professionals that took that came from the behavioral sciences and made recommendations, and I think bishops followed what their recommendations were. I think the second important thing is that, and this is where Bishop Wuerl came in with full force, bishops didn't have as much freedom in the 1990s and before that to be able to pull priests from ministry. And we know that from the famous Cipolla case, you know, where Bishop Wuerl pulled the priest from ministry. The Vatican then said to him, "You got to put him back in. You're violating his rights." And the bishop said no, and he fought it. Went to the Signature, which is the Supreme Court of the Church, and a couple years later, the court reversed itself and said, "You're right. Bishops can remove priests from ministry."
We only have about a minute or so to go here. Have you two discussed where the church, especially the Diocese of Pittsburgh, goes from here? How are you going to handle things? Anything is going to change?
I think for sure that, you know, the things that I've laid out, we have to continue to build on what we've done in the past. And I think second of all, this needs to be noted, that we're taking seriously what the Attorney General has called forth for us to look at. There's 4 particular points. The thing that I argue for and will continue to argue for, if we're going to take a look at those 4 points of the Attorney General's plan, it's got to apply all across the board. It can't be just to private institutions, it has to be to every institution, because if we don't include every institution, then we're not being truthful about when we say we have to have the victims at heart.
Any more indication as to whether any names are going to be removed from schools or buildings of previous bishops?
Well, I think that we're certainly taking a look at that in earnest, for sure.
Is there any indication that Cardinal Wuerl might voluntarily remove his name, ask that his name be removed?
Well, I think that it'll be important for all of us to wait and see how that all falls out.
Right. I want to thank you both for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. David and I will be back with some final thoughts in just a moment.